Rude cashier learns shocking truth. Black undercover boss owns the diner. The dinner rush at Wilson's family diner was in full swing when Sarah Jenkins slammed the register drawer shut with such force that several customers looked up from their meals. Her face was twisted with fury as she glared at the older black man standing before her, his worn maintenance uniform bearing a simple gym name tag. "I don't care who you think you are," Sarah snapped, her voice carrying across the restaurant. "You've been here 3 days and you're telling me how to do my job? I've worked this register for 2 years." The diner fell silent. Forks paused midway to mouths. The sizzling of the grill in the background seemed suddenly louder. Jim stood straight, his dignified posture contrasting with his simple uniform. His eyes, wise and weathered from his 65 years of life, never left Sarah's face. "Young lady," he said, his deep voice calm but firm, "all I suggested was that you might want to double-check the order before calling it out. The gentleman asked for no onions due to his allergy." Sarah's cheeks flushed red. "Don't you young lady me, who do you think you are? Some new janitor on a power trip?" Bob, the elderly cook, emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. "Sarah, that's enough." "No," Sarah cut him off. "I'm sick of being disrespected. I'm sick of being treated like I don't matter. You know what? I quit. Let's see how you run this place without me." She yanked off her name tag and slammed it on the counter. The small piece of plastic skittered across the surface and fell to the floor with a small clatter that seemed to echo in the silence. Jim bent down slowly, his knees creaking slightly as he picked up the name tag. When he straightened, his expression had changed. Gone was the meek maintenance man. In his place stood someone altogether different, someone with authority. "Sarah Jenkins," he said, his voice now resonating with a quiet power that commanded attention. "Before you walk out that door, there's something you should know." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, placing it gently on the counter. Sarah's eyes widened as she read it. "My name is James Wilson. I own this diner, and 47 others across 3 states. Gasps rippled through the restaurant. Sarah's face drained of color, her hand flying to her mouth. "But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when—" The scene at the diner dissolved into the elegant office of Wilson Restaurant Group's headquarters. James Wilson sat behind a large mahogany desk, dressed in an impeccable charcoal suit, reviewing quarterly reports while a framed photograph of Martin Luther King Jr. hung prominently on the wall behind him. His wife, Martha, elegant in her mid-50s with silver streaks in her dark hair, placed a cup of coffee beside him. "James, you've been staring at those numbers for hours," Martha said, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "What's troubling you?" James removed his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Something's not adding up, Martha. Our Westside location's numbers have been declining for 6 months straight. Customer complaints are up, and staff turnover is through the roof." Martha nodded knowingly. "Diane's location, you promoted her to manager last year." "Yes," James confirmed. "She had such promise, started as a waitress in '85, worked her way up, but now," he shook his head. "The reports tell one story, but I need to see for myself what's happening. You remember what my father always said, the truth is found at the counter, not in the books," Martha finished with a smile. "You're thinking of going undercover again, aren't you?" James's eyes crinkled at the corners. "It worked in '92 when we had that trouble in Springfield, and again in 2008 during the recession." "That was different, James. You're not a young man anymore," Martha cautioned, concern evident in her voice. "I'm only 65, James protested with a chuckle. "Just because we've got grandkids doesn't mean I'm ready for the rocking chair." Martha smiled and shook her head. "Well, if you're determined to do this, you'd better find your old work clothes. I think they're in the attic with your Beatles albums." 3 hours later, James Wilson walked through the employee's entrance of his Westside diner, dressed in a gray maintenance uniform, a toolbox in hand. Gone was the confident business owner. In his place stood Jim, the new handyman hired to fix various issues around the restaurant. Bob Taylor, the 70-year-old cook who had been with the company for nearly 3 decades, was the only employee who knew James's true identity. They'd arranged everything over the phone that morning. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Bob said with a wink when James entered the kitchen. "The new maintenance guy right on time." James grinned and spoke quietly. "How bad is it, Bob?" Bob's jovial expression sobered. "Worse than your reports show, James. Diane's hardly ever here, leaves Sarah in charge most days, and that girl's got a chip on her shoulder the size of Mount Rushmore." "Sarah, the cashier?" "That's her, young single mother. Smart as a whip but prickly as a cactus. Been through some tough times from what I gather." James nodded thoughtfully. "And the other staff? Most of the good ones have quit. The ones who stayed either can't find better work or haven't been pushed to their breaking point yet." Bob lowered his voice further. Diane's been cutting corners everywhere, cheaper ingredients, shorter shifts, no maintenance. That broken freezer you're supposedly here to fix, been that way for 2 months. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the front door chimes. Bob peered through the service window. Speaking of the devil, he muttered. That's Sarah arriving for her shift, and she's got her boy with her again. James watched discreetly as a harried-looking young woman rushed in, pulling a small boy by the hand. She was pretty beneath her obvious exhaustion, with dark hair hastily pulled back and shadows under her eyes. The child, about 8 years old, clutched a worn backpack to his chest. "Sorry I'm late," Sarah called out, her voice already defensive. Michael's sitter canceled again. James could hear Diane's irritated response from the manager's office. "That's the 3rd time this month, Sarah. You know the policy about bringing kids to work." "What am I supposed to do?" Sarah shot back. "Leave him home alone. He's 8. "Not my problem," Diane replied dismissively. "Just put him in the corner booth and make sure he stays quiet." Sarah's face tightened, but she nodded curtly and led her son to a booth in the corner, setting him up with homework and a coloring book. "That boy's as quiet as a church mouse," Bob commented to James. "Never causes any trouble. Diane just likes to throw her weight around." James frowned. His company had always prided itself on being family-friendly, both for customers and employees. This wasn't the policy he'd established. "Well," he said, picking up his toolbox, "guess I'd better start with that freezer." Over the next few hours, James worked on various repairs while observing the diner's operations. He noted the worn-out equipment, the corners being cut on portions, and most troublingly, the way Diane spoke to her staff when she was actually present. She spent most of her time in the office or taking extended breaks, but it was Sarah who captured most of his attention. Despite her obvious exhaustion, she worked tirelessly, handling the register, helping to bus tables when they were short-staffed, and periodically checking on her son. Her manner with customers was efficient but brusque, lacking the warmth that James had always emphasized as part of the Wilsons' family diner experience. During a lull in the afternoon, James approached the counter where Sarah was counting receipts. "Busy day," he commented mildly. Sarah barely glanced up. "Every day is busy when you're understaffed." "How long have you worked here?" James asked. 2 years, she replied shortly. Then, perhaps feeling she'd been too curt, she added, "Started right after Michael and I moved to this neighborhood." "Seems like a good kid," James nodded toward Michael, who was quietly reading in his booth. Something in Sarah's expression softened momentarily. "He is too good for what he's had to deal with." The vulnerability vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "Anyway, don't you have a leaky sink to fix or something?" James smiled. "Just taking my break, thought I'd get to know my new coworkers." Sarah's eyebrow arched skeptically. "Don't get too comfortable. Maintenance guys don't last long here. Diane says they're an unnecessary expense." "Is that so?" James asked, his interest piqued. "That's what she says about pretty much everything these days," Sarah replied. "Cost-cutting is her middle name." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Frank Davis, a regular customer in his 60s who came in every afternoon for coffee and pie. "Afternoon, Sarah," Frank greeted her warmly. "How's my favorite cashier today?" For the first time that day, James saw Sarah smile genuinely. "I'm all right, Frank, the usual. You know it, and maybe a little something for the scholar over there." Frank nodded toward Michael. "You don't have to do that," Sarah protested, but Frank waved her off. "What good is being a retired teacher if I can't spoil a good student now and then?" As Sarah went to get Frank's order, the older man turned to James. "New face around here," he observed. "You must be the maintenance man they finally hired." James nodded. "Jim," he introduced himself, offering his hand. Frank shook it firmly. "Frank Davis, been coming here since this place opened 15 years ago. Used to be a great spot. Lately, though," he shook his head. "What changed?" James asked casually. Frank lowered his voice. "New manager about a year ago. Place has been going downhill since. Food's not the same quality, staff always seems stressed, equipment breaking down." He nodded toward Sarah, who was pouring his coffee. "That girl's got it especially tough. Single mom, works 2 jobs, going to night school. She's got fire in her, that one. Reminds me of my late wife." James was about to respond when Diane emerged from the office, talking loudly on her cell phone about her weekend plans. She barely acknowledged the staff or customers as she headed for the exit. "I'm heading out for a meeting," she announced to no one in particular. "Sarah, you're in charge, and get that kid out of here before the dinner rush." Sarah's knuckles whitened around the coffee pot, but she said nothing as Diane departed. "3rd time this week she's left early," Frank commented. "Not exactly a hands-on manager, is she?" Later that evening, as the dinner rush approached, James observed Sarah becoming increasingly stressed. Michael sat forgotten in his corner as she rushed between tasks. When a delivery arrived, she was forced to sign for it while simultaneously trying to work the register. James approached her quietly. "Need a hand?" "I've got it," she snapped, dropping her pen in frustration. "I could watch the register for a minute while you deal with the delivery," he offered. "Do you even know how to work a register?" she asked skeptically. James smiled. "I've picked up a few skills over the years." Reluctantly, Sarah stepped aside. James smoothly took over, greeting the next customer with a warm smile that transformed his face. "Welcome to Wilson's Family Diner. What can I get for you today?" The customer, a middle-aged woman, smiled back, responding to his genuine warmth. "I'll have the meatloaf special, please." "Excellent choice," James replied, entering the order with practiced ease. "The meatloaf recipe here is over 40 years old, came from the founder's mother, if I recall correctly." Sarah returned just in time to hear this exchange, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. "How would you know that? You just started today." James recovered quickly. "Bob mentioned it earlier, said it was famous." Sarah seemed unconvinced but was too busy to pursue it. The dinner rush was intensifying and several orders were backing up. James noticed Bob struggling alone in the kitchen. "Where's the other cook?" he asked Sarah. "Called in sick again," she replied tersely. "That's the third time this week." James put down the tool he'd been using to fix a wobbly table and rolled up his sleeves. "I used to work a grill in my younger days. Let me help Bob." Before Sarah could protest, James made his way to the kitchen. Bob looked up in surprise as James joined him at the grill. "You sure about this?" Bob muttered quietly. "Like riding a bicycle," James replied, expertly flipping a burger. "Besides, these are my recipes. I should know how to cook them." The dinner service proceeded more smoothly with James's help, though he noted with concern how many shortcuts were being taken, portion sizes smaller than his specifications, cheaper ingredients substituted for the ones in his original recipes, and preparation methods altered to save time at the expense of quality. When he pointed this out to Bob, the older cook sighed heavily. "Diane's orders," he explained. "Said we needed to cut food costs by 20%. I fought it at first, but—" He shrugged helplessly. "But what?" James pressed. "She threatened to replace me with someone younger who wouldn't question her methods. At my age, with my arthritis, not many places would hire me. I need this job, James." James felt a surge of anger at how his loyal employee had been treated, but he kept his expression neutral. "I understand, Bob. Do what you need to do." As the evening progressed, James continued to observe Sarah. Despite her brusque manner, he noticed her going out of her way to help an elderly couple find a comfortable booth and giving extra napkins to a mother with a toddler without being asked. There was a good employee underneath the hard exterior, one who was being crushed by circumstances. At one point, James saw Sarah checking on Michael, who had fallen asleep with his head on his school books. Her expression as she gently brushed hair from his forehead was so tender it transformed her entire face. Then she noticed James watching and the walls slammed back into place. "Don't you have work to do?" she challenged. "Just taking a break," James replied calmly. "Your boy looks tired." "Long day for a kid." Something in his tone must have conveyed genuine concern rather than criticism, because Sarah's defensive posture relaxed slightly. "Yeah, well, not much choice. Sitter canceled and I can't afford to miss a shift." She hesitated, then added, "He's a good kid, never complains even when he has to spend hours here." "What about his father?" James asked gently. Sarah's expression hardened again. "Not in the picture, left when I told him I was pregnant." "Said he wasn't ready for responsibility." She made air quotes around the words, her voice bitter. "His loss," James said simply. Sarah looked at him sharply, as if expecting a trap, but his expression held nothing but sincerity. "Yeah, well," she said, her voice softer, "we manage." She glanced at the clock and tensed. "Break's over, dinner rush will hit its peak soon." The evening continued to get busier. A large party arrived without a reservation, causing chaos in the seating arrangement. Then the ancient credit card machine began malfunctioning. Sarah's stress levels visibly escalated with each new problem, her responses to customers becoming increasingly curt. James was fixing a leaky pipe under the sink when he overheard a customer at the counter complaining about his order. "I specifically asked for no onions," the man was saying, pushing his plate away. "I'm allergic. This is covered in onions." "That's how the chef prepares it," Sarah replied tightly. "If you have allergies, you should be more clear when ordering." "I was clear," the man insisted, his face reddening. "I said no onions twice." "Sir, I put in the order exactly as you gave it to me." Sarah's voice was rising. "If there's a mistake, it's not my fault." James emerged from beneath the sink and approached the counter. He could see Bob through the service window, looking concerned. A quick glance at the order ticket showed that the no onions modification hadn't been entered. "Excuse me," James said politely to both Sarah and the customer. "Perhaps I can help resolve this." "This isn't your concern," Sarah snapped at him. "Maybe not," James acknowledged, "but I couldn't help overhearing. Sir, I apologize for the confusion. We'll prepare a new meal for you right away, no onions." He turned to Sarah. "The order ticket doesn't show the modification. Maybe it was missed when it was entered." And that was when Sarah exploded. "I don't care who you think you are," she snapped, her voice carrying across the restaurant. "You've been here 3 days and you're telling me how to do my job? I've worked this register for 2 years. The diner fell silent. Forks paused midway to mouths. The sizzling of the grill in the background seemed suddenly louder. Jim stood straight, his dignified posture contrasting with his simple uniform. His eyes, wise and weathered from his 65 years of life, never left Sarah's face. "Young lady," he said, his deep voice calm but firm, "all I suggested was that you might want to double-check the order before calling it out. The gentleman asked for no onions due to his allergy." Sarah's cheeks flushed red. "Don't you young lady me? Who do you think you are? Some new janitor on a power trip?" Bob emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. "Sarah, that's enough." "No," Sarah cut him off. "I'm sick of being disrespected. I'm sick of being treated like I don't matter. You know what? I quit. Let's see how you run this place without me." She yanked off her name tag and slammed it on the counter. The small piece of plastic skittered across the surface and fell to the floor with a small clatter that seemed to echo in the silence. Jim bent down slowly, his knees creaking slightly as he picked up the name tag. When he straightened, his expression had changed. Gone was the meek maintenance man. In his place stood someone altogether different, someone with authority. "Sarah Jenkins," he said, his voice now resonating with a quiet power that commanded attention. "Before you walk out that door, there's something you should know." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, placing it gently on the counter. Sarah's eyes widened as she read it. "My name is James Wilson. I own this diner, and 47 others across 3 states. You're the man from that article in Black Enterprise magazine last year. From busboy to business mogul? That was you." James smiled slightly. "That's right, Frank, though the headline was more dramatic than the reality. It was a long, slow journey from washing dishes at my father's lunch counter during the civil rights era to building this company." Sarah's initial shock was giving way to a simmering anger. "So this was all a setup, some kind of gotcha moment to humiliate me before firing me." James's expression softened. "Not at all, Sarah. This is something I've done periodically throughout my career, working undercover in my own restaurants to see firsthand what's happening. The reports showed this location was struggling, but they couldn't tell me why." He gestured for her to sit on one of the counter stools. After a moment's hesitation, she perched rigidly on the edge of the seat. "Now I understand," James continued. "It's not just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about Diane's absence and poor management. It's about corners being cut on quality. It's about loyal employees like Bob being threatened if they don't comply with policies that go against our company values." He looked directly at Sarah. "And it's about good people being pushed to their breaking point by circumstances beyond their control." Sarah's eyes darted to Michael's sleeping form, then back to James. Her posture remained defensive, but some of the anger had drained from her expression. "So what happens now?" she asked. "You fire me for insubordination and go back to your corporate office?" James shook his head. "That's not how I do business, Sarah, never has been." He turned to address the entire restaurant. "Folks, I apologize for the disruption to your meal. Please enjoy the rest of your evening. Everything is on the house tonight." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the diner. James turned back to Sarah. "You and I need to talk, but this isn't the place. Bob can handle things here for the rest of the evening." He glanced at Michael. "Why don't we move to a quieter booth where your son can continue sleeping and we can speak privately?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded stiffly. She went to Michael, gently lifting him without waking him, and carried him to a booth in the far corner of the diner. James followed, giving Bob a meaningful look as he passed. The older cook nodded in understanding. Once they were seated with Michael still sleeping peacefully across the vinyl bench, James spoke quietly. "First, let me make something clear. You're not fired, Sarah, not unless you want to be." Sarah's eyebrows rose in surprise. "After the way I just spoke to you after I quit," James smiled slightly. "I've been called worse things in my 70 years, believe me, and as for quitting," he shrugged. "Heat of the moment, we all say things we don't mean sometimes." Sarah studied him suspiciously. "Why would you want to keep me around? You've seen how I am with customers. I've seen a young woman working herself to exhaustion, trying to support her child while dealing with a manager who doesn't support her," James corrected gently. I've also seen moments of genuine care with Frank, with that elderly couple, with the young mother and her toddler. Those moments tell me more about who you really are than a single outburst under extreme stress. Sarah's defensive posture didn't change, but something in her eyes did, a flicker of uncertainty, as if she wasn't used to being seen in a positive light. "Tell me about yourself, Sarah," James said. "How did you come to work at my diner?" Sarah hesitated, then exhaled slowly. "It's not a pretty story." "Few real stories are," James replied. "Mine certainly wasn't." Something in his tone resonated with her. She glanced at her sleeping son, then began speaking in a low voice. "I was 19 when I got pregnant with Michael, dropped out of community college, got left by his father, the whole cliché." Her tone was matter-of-fact, without self-pity. "My parents made it clear they wouldn't support my poor choices, as they called it, so I was on my own." "That must have been terrifying," James observed quietly. Sarah's eyes flashed with surprise, as if she hadn't expected understanding. "It was, but I managed, worked whatever jobs I could find while Michael was little. Then when he started school, I got more stable work. Was a receptionist at an accounting firm for 3 years. What happened?" "COVID happened," Sarah replied grimly. "Firm downsized, last hired, first fired. We scraped by on unemployment for a while, but when that ran out," she shrugged. "We lost our apartment, lived in my car for 2 weeks before a women's shelter helped us find temporary housing. That's when we moved to this neighborhood. Diane hired me and the pay was just enough to get a small apartment nearby." "And you're going to night school?" James asked, recalling what Frank had mentioned. Sarah looked surprised again. "How did you know that?" "Frank mentioned it. He seems to think highly of you." A ghost of a smile touched Sarah's lips. "Frank's a good guy, reminds me of what a grandfather should be like." The smile faded. "Yeah, I'm taking accounting classes 3 nights a week. Michael stays with a neighbor those nights." "When she's available," she added with a grimace. "That's impressive dedication," James said sincerely. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "I don't need your pity." "That's not pity, Sarah, that's respect," James corrected her firmly. "I recognize determination when I see it because I lived it. Do you know how I started in this business?" Sarah shook her head. "Washing dishes at my father's lunch counter in Alabama, 15 hours a day, 6 days a week from the time I was 12 years old. In 1963, when I was 16, our place was firebombed during the civil rights movement because my father had been helping register black voters." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "We lost everything," James continued. "Had to start over in a new city with nothing but the clothes on our backs. I worked 3 jobs to help my family rebuild. Bus tables at a diner during the day, janitor at a school in the evenings, and security guard on weekends." He paused, his eyes distant with memories. "I missed my high school graduation because I was working, couldn't afford college, but I kept learning about cooking, about business, about people, saved every penny. When I was 30, I had enough to open my first small diner." He smiled slightly. "Martha, my wife, thought I was crazy to risk our savings, but she supported me anyway." "And now you own 47 diners," Sarah said, a note of grudging respect in her voice. 48, James corrected with a small smile. "We just opened a new location in Memphis last month." His expression grew serious again. "But I never forgot what it was like to struggle, to feel like the world was against me. That's why, when I started this company, I made a promise to myself that my employees would be treated with dignity and respect, that they'd have opportunities I never had." He leaned forward slightly. "Which is why I'm so troubled by what I've seen here these past few days. This isn't how a Wilson's family diner is supposed to operate." Sarah's eyes dropped to the table. "Diane says we have to cut costs to stay profitable. That corporate would close us down if we didn't." "Corporate?" James repeated with a wry smile. "That would be me, and I can assure you I've never authorized cutting quality, mistreating staff, or ignoring maintenance issues." He shook his head. "Diane has been systematically violating every principle this company was built on." "So you'll fire her?" Sarah asked bluntly. "That's a conversation I'll have with her tomorrow," James replied. "But right now I'm more interested in you." "Me?" Sarah looked wary again. "You've been pursuing an accounting degree while raising a child alone and working full-time. That shows intelligence, dedication, and remarkable resilience, qualities I value highly in my company." Sarah's expression remained guarded, but James could see he had her full attention now. "I'd like to offer you a position in our accounting department at corporate headquarters," he said. "Entry-level, but with a clear path for advancement as you complete your degree. Full benefits, including health insurance for you and Michael. And," he added with emphasis, "flexible hours that would accommodate your class schedule and parenting responsibilities." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "Is this some kind of joke?" I don't joke about business opportunities, Sarah, or about helping people who deserve a chance. James's expression was entirely serious. You have fire, intelligence, and determination. Those are rare qualities, and I'd be a fool not to recognize their value. Sarah's eyes glistened suddenly with unshed tears. She blinked them away quickly, looking down at Michael as if to gather strength from his sleeping form. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "After how I treated you," James smiled gently. "Because 45 years ago, someone gave me a chance when I didn't deserve it. A restaurant owner named Harold Jenkins saw past my rough edges and recognized my potential." He paused. "Any relation by chance?" Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "Jenkins, my grandfather's name was Harold. He owned a restaurant in Chicago in the 70s. James's smile broadened. "Small world." "Harold gave me my first management position when no one else would hire a young black man without a college education for anything but menial work. He changed the course of my life." He looked at Sarah with newfound warmth. "And now it seems I have the opportunity to repay that debt to his granddaughter." Sarah's composure finally cracked. A tear slid down her cheek, which she hastily wiped away. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "Say you'll consider the offer," James replied. "Take a few days to think about it, talk it over with Michael. This would mean relocating closer to our headquarters, so it's a big decision." Sarah nodded slowly, still seeming stunned by the turn of events. Michael stirred on the bench beside her, his eyes fluttering open. "Mom," he murmured sleepily. "Is it time to go home?" Sarah stroked his hair gently. "Almost, sweetheart, just a few more minutes." As Michael became more aware of his surroundings, he noticed James sitting across from them. "Who are you?" he asked with a child's directness. "This is Mr. Wilson," Sarah explained, her voice unsteady. He owns the restaurant." Michael's eyes widened. "The whole restaurant?" James smiled. "This one and a few others." "Cool," Michael said with simple appreciation, then his brow furrowed. "Are you mad at my mom? She works really hard, you know." "Michael," Sarah began, embarrassed, but James held up a hand. "I know she does," he told Michael seriously. "In fact, I was just telling your mother how impressed I am with her work ethic. That's why I've offered her a new job at my company headquarters." "A new job?" Michael echoed, looking up at his mother with sudden excitement. "Does that mean you won't have to work nights anymore and I won't have to stay with Mrs. Gonzalez?" Sarah swallowed hard. "We're going to talk about it, honey. It's a big decision." "But you'd be home more?" Michael pressed hopefully. "Yes," James confirmed before Sarah could hedge. "Your mother would have regular business hours, nights and weekends free. And," he added with a twinkle in his eye, "the company headquarters has a child care center for after school." Michael's face lit up. "Mom, can we do it, please?" Sarah looked at her son's hopeful expression, then at James's gentle smile, and something in her seemed to give way, a wall of defensiveness built up over years of disappointment and struggle. "See, baby," she said softly, but her expression as she met James's eyes held a new emotion, hope. As the evening wound down, James helped Bob close the diner. Sarah had taken Michael home with a promise to return the next day to discuss the offer further. The two older men worked in companionable silence for a while, wiping down counters and putting away supplies. "You did a good thing tonight, James," Bob finally said as they finished up. "That girl's had a rough go of it, but she's got potential." "Thanks to you for keeping an eye on her," James replied, "and for sticking it out here despite Diane's mismanagement." Bob shrugged. "Where else would I go? This place has been my second home for nearly 30 years. "Well, things are going to change around here," James promised. "Starting tomorrow." The next morning, James arrived at the diner early, dressed in his business suit rather than the maintenance uniform. He'd called Martha the night before to fill her in on everything he'd discovered, and she had arrived late that evening to join him at his hotel. "You're sure about offering Sarah the position?" Martha had asked as they discussed his plans. "Absolutely," James had replied without hesitation. "Not just because of her connection to Harold, though that feels like fate. She has exactly the kind of drive and intelligence we need. With the right mentorship, she could go far." Martha had smiled at him fondly. "Always looking for diamonds in the rough, aren't you?" "Takes one to know one," he'd replied with a wink. Now, as he sat at the counter with a cup of coffee, waiting for Diane to arrive for her shift, James reflected on how this undercover mission had turned out differently than he'd expected. He'd come looking for the source of declining profits and found instead a story of human struggle and resilience, a reminder of why he'd started this business in the first place. Bob emerged from the kitchen, smiling broadly when he saw James in his suit. "Now that's more like it. The boss is back." "Never left," James replied with a chuckle. "Just changed my clothes." The front door chimed, and they both turned to see Diane entering, engrossed in her cell phone conversation. She was halfway to her office before she noticed James sitting at the counter. Her steps faltered, confusion crossing her face. "I'll call you back," she said into the phone before hanging up. "Can I help you, sir?" James stood, extending his hand. "Diane Miller, James Wilson, CEO of Wilson Restaurant Group." Diane's face paled. "Mr. Wilson, we weren't expecting. I mean, if I'd known you were coming, I would have prepared." "That was rather the point," James interrupted smoothly. "I've been here for the past 3 days, observing operations firsthand." Diane's eyes widened as understanding dawned. You were the maintenance man." "I was," James confirmed. "And what I observed was deeply troubling." "Would you join me in your office to discuss it?" Diane swallowed hard but nodded, leading the way to the small office at the back of the diner. Once the door closed behind them, James wasted no time. "Diane, I've discovered numerous violations of company policy during my time here. Cost-cutting measures that compromise food quality, maintenance issues left unaddressed, staff being mistreated, and perhaps most concerning, your frequent absences during business hours." Diane's expression shifted from nervousness to defensiveness. "With all due respect, Mr. Wilson, you don't understand the pressure managers are under to keep locations profitable. The budget cuts from corporate. There have been no authorized budget cuts," James interrupted firmly. "In fact, our company has consistently increased location budgets over the past 2 years to account for rising costs." Diane fell silent, her face flushing. "What I believe has happened," James continued, "is that you've been cutting costs to artificially inflate the location's profitability numbers that directly affect your performance bonuses." Diane's silence confirmed his suspicion. "I've also learned that you've been intimidating longtime employees like Bob, threatening their job security if they don't comply with your unauthorized changes." James's voice hardened. "That goes against everything this company stands for." "So I'm fired," Diane said flatly. "That depends," James replied, surprising her. "I believe in second chances, Diane. I'm willing to offer you one, but it would mean a transfer to another location, under the direct supervision of one of our most experienced managers. A probationary period during which you would need to demonstrate your commitment to the company's values and policies." Diane looked up, clearly not having expected this outcome. "Why would you give me that chance?" "Because firing people is easy. Helping them grow is harder, but ultimately more valuable." James leaned forward. "The question is, do you want that chance? Are you willing to admit your mistakes and learn from them?" There was a long moment of silence as Diane considered her options. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Yes," she said quietly. "I do want that chance." "Good," James said, standing up. "Martha will contact you tomorrow with the details of your transfer. In the meantime, I'll be overseeing this location personally for the next few weeks." As they exited the office, James saw that Sarah had arrived. She stood uncertainly near the counter, dressed more professionally than the day before, with Michael beside her. "Ah, Sarah," James greeted her warmly. "Perfect timing. Diane, would you excuse us?" Diane nodded and retreated to the office to gather her things. James approached Sarah with a smile. "You came back," he observed. "I said I would," she replied, lifting her chin slightly. "I don't break my promises." "A commendable quality," James said. He looked down at Michael. "And how are you this morning, young man?" "Good," Michael replied shyly. "Mom says we might be moving." "We've been talking about your offer," Sarah explained, her expression more open than it had been the day before. "I have some questions about the details, but if it's really legitimate, we're interested." "It's absolutely legitimate," James assured her. "In fact, Martha, my wife and the company's CFO, is at our hotel right now, preparing the official offer letter. She's looking forward to meeting you." Sarah's posture relaxed slightly. "I spoke with my school counselor this morning. She says my credits would transfer to the community college near your headquarters." "Excellent," James nodded. "And I've already spoken with our HR department about tuition reimbursement for employees continuing their education." Sarah's eyes widened. "You'd pay for my classes?" "For classes related to your position, yes. It's a standard company benefit that Diane should have informed you about when you were hired." James shook his head slightly. "Another oversight on her part." The front door chimed again, and Martha Wilson entered the diner. She was elegantly dressed in a burgundy suit, her silver-streaked hair swept up in a stylish updo. She spotted James immediately and approached with a warm smile. "There you are," she said, kissing his cheek before turning to Sarah. "And you must be Sarah Jenkins. James told me all about you last night." Sarah looked suddenly nervous again. "Yes, ma'am." Martha waved away the formality. "Please call me Martha. Any granddaughter of Harold Jenkins is practically family." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "He told you about that connection?" "Of course," Martha replied. Harold was a legend in the restaurant business. James has often said he wouldn't be where he is today without Harold's mentorship. She turned to Michael with a grandmotherly smile. And this handsome young man must be Michael. Michael nodded, clearly awed by Martha's presence. I have something for you, Martha told him, reaching into her handbag. She pulled out a small toy car, a vintage Matchbox replica of a 1965 Mustang. James mentioned you like cars. Michael's eyes lit up as he accepted the gift. Thank you, he exclaimed, immediately beginning to examine its details. I hope that's all right, Martha said to Sarah. I raised 3 boys of my own. They never could resist a good Matchbox car. Sarah smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her face. It's very thoughtful, thank you. Now, Martha said, getting down to business, I've brought the offer letter for you to review. She produced an envelope from her briefcase. Take your time with it, ask any questions you have, and know that this is just the beginning. We see great potential in you, Sarah. Sarah accepted the envelope with slightly trembling hands. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything right now, James assured her. Review the offer, think about what's best for you and Michael. We'll respect whatever decision you make. 2 weeks later, the West Side Diner was transformed. James had personally overseen a thorough cleaning and renovation, replacing worn equipment, refreshing the decor, and reinstating the original recipes and portion sizes that had made Wilson's family diners successful. Bob had been promoted to location manager, a position he had declined years earlier due to his preference for cooking, but now accepted with pride. James had hired 2 new cooks trained personally by Bob, ensuring the quality of food would remain consistent. The dinner rush was in full swing, but the atmosphere was entirely different from the tense, chaotic environment of 2 weeks prior. Staff moved efficiently, but without the frantic stress that had characterized the diner under Diane's management. Customers were greeted warmly, orders were accurate, and the food emerging from the kitchen met James's exacting standards. James sat at the counter, observing with satisfaction. Martha was beside him, chatting amiably with Frank Davis, who had been delighted to learn the identity of the maintenance man he'd been speaking with. The place hasn't felt this good since it opened, Frank was telling Martha. Reminds me of the old days. That's exactly what we're aiming for, Martha replied with a smile. The original vision, but better. The front door chimed, and James looked up to see Sarah and Michael entering. They were dressed for travel, and Michael was excitedly pulling his mother toward the counter. You made it, James greeted them, standing to welcome them. All packed and ready for the drive tomorrow. Sarah nodded, a new confidence in her bearing. Everything's in the car, the apartment's empty. She looked around the diner with a hint of nostalgia. Wanted to say goodbye to this place before we left. Hard to believe so much has changed in just 2 weeks. Change can happen quickly when it's meant to be, Martha observed. Just like when James and I opened our first diner all those years ago, Sarah smiled. Bob told me to come by before we left. Is he here? In the kitchen, James replied. Go on back, he's expecting you. Sarah and Michael headed for the kitchen while James and Martha exchanged pleased glances. She's going to do well, Martha predicted. I can feel it. Harold would be proud, James agreed. Full circle moment. In the kitchen, Bob was supervising the dinner service but broke into a broad smile when he saw Sarah and Michael. There they are, he exclaimed. My favorite cashier and her little man all ready for their big adventure. Sarah hugged the older man tightly. We wanted to say goodbye properly and thank you for everything. Bob waved off her thanks. I didn't do anything special. You were kind to me even when I didn't deserve it, Sarah said seriously. You looked out for Michael. That means more than you know. Bob's eyes grew misty. Well, you two were a bright spot in this old man's day, that's for sure. He reached behind him and produced a small cooler. Made you some road snacks for the drive tomorrow. Sandwiches, cookies, and Michael's favorite chocolate milk. Michael's face lit up. Thank you, Mr. Bob. And this, Bob added, handing Sarah a small, wrapped package, is something special. Don't open it until you're settled in your new place. Sarah accepted it with a curious smile. What is it? Just a little something to remind you where you came from, Bob replied cryptically, and that you've always got family here if you need us. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of gratitude rather than distress. I'll never forget what you all did for me, for us, she added, putting an arm around Michael. You did the hard part yourself, Bob told her seriously. All that determination, all that grit, that was all you, Sarah. James and Martha just recognized what was already there. They rejoined James and Martha at the counter where Frank was preparing to leave. So the big move is tomorrow, huh? Frank asked Sarah. Nashville's lucky to have you. We're nervous but excited, Sarah admitted. Michael's already talking about decorating his new room. It's gonna have a space theme, Michael informed them solemnly. with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. Sounds perfect, Martha approved. And you'll have to come visit us once you're settled. Our grandchildren would love to meet you. As they chatted, the diner continued its dinner service around them, the atmosphere warm and inviting, exactly what James had envisioned when he opened his first restaurant decades ago. A place where people felt welcome, where good food was served with care, and where employees were treated with dignity and respect. Later that evening, as James and Martha walked back to their hotel, Martha took his arm and leaned against his shoulder. "You did good, James Wilson," she said softly. "Harold would be proud." James smiled, thinking of the young man he'd once been washing dishes in his father's small lunch counter in Alabama, dreaming of something better but never imagining how far he would go. "It's funny how life works," he mused. "Harold gave me a chance all those years ago, and now I've been able to do the same for his granddaughter." "Full circle," Martha agreed. "More than that," James said thoughtfully. "It's about legacy, not just buildings or bank accounts, but people, lives changed, opportunities created." He looked up at the stars appearing in the evening sky. "That's the real measure of success." 6 months later, James stood in the doorway of the accounting department at Wilson Restaurant Group headquarters, watching with satisfaction as Sarah confidently presented her analysis of quarterly cost projections to the department head. Gone was the defensive, stressed young woman from the West Side diner. In her place stood a professional, poised and articulate, who had already impressed her colleagues with her work ethic and keen mind. Michael was thriving as well, enrolled in a good school and making friends at the company's after-school program. His bedroom ceiling was indeed decorated with glow-in-the-dark stars, as James and Martha had discovered when invited to dinner at Sarah's new apartment the previous month. The small package from Bob had contained a framed photograph of Harold Jenkins standing proudly in front of his Chicago restaurant in 1975, with a young James Wilson beside him. Sarah had placed it prominently on her living room wall, a reminder of where she'd come from and of the unexpected connections that had changed the course of her life. As Sarah concluded her presentation to approving nods from her colleagues, she spotted James in the doorway and smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. James nodded in acknowledgement, remembering another young person with rough edges and untapped potential who had been given a chance decades ago. The circle was complete. The legacy continued. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.